Okay, in this video we're going to learn a little bit more about JavaScript objects. So I've created objects.js, a file on my desktop, and I have my terminal located in my desktop, and we're going to run this JS file using Node.js. So let's start out with the simple console.log and get some nice labeling so we can tell what's going on in the program. So I'm going to create an object and I'm going to name it A. That's going to be the variable name. So to declare a variable called A, I use the let keyword A. This would be a declaration statement by itself. I can combine that with an assignment statement using a single equals and assign a value to this. The simplest way to assign a variable, an object, is to create one literally. This is called an object literal. This is an empty object literal. I've created left and right curly brackets, which is the syntax, meaning an empty object literal. And so now I can console.log the type of this. And console.log the object itself. Right? And we can run it with node objects.js, and we see object A, that's our console.log. The type of this is object, and we see when we print it out, we see the curly brackets and that it is in fact empty. One thing to note is we cannot do a length property like we can with arrays. A.length does not work. So if I run this, we see we've got an error. Or actually it just returns undefined, because otherwise it would assume that length is a property attached in our object. I could theoretically have a property here called length. Alright, so that's why that doesn't work. Alright, so a.length won't work to find out how many items we have in our object. So instead, we can use some tricks to get an array out of the keys of our object, or an array of the values, and find the length that way. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But first, let's add some data to our object. Let's say this is going to be a person object, and we can say first name is Amelia, and then an alternative way to specify a key is using quotation marks. Last name, colon, and then Anderson. So if you're familiar with Python, this is similar to a dictionary, except Python dictionaries require you to have quotes around all of the key value names, which gets a little tedious typing all that out. JavaScript is nice and doesn't require that. However, it does require it if you have characters that can't be represented in an identifier. So for example, if I had a space here, JavaScript gets confused because that looks like a variable, and then you have a space, so this is a separate variable, and it doesn't quite know what to do, right? So if I wanted a space in my key, I have to use quotation marks when I'm defining my variable. Okay. So here we've got first name, and we've got last name. I might need to hyphenate it for some reason. That might be how my keys are set up. So last name. Here we've got camel case, which is perfectly legal identifier for JavaScript, and here we have kebab case, which is not legal for identifiers, so we have to use hyphens there. Alright, so we've got first name and last name, and we get the type, and we log that out so we can run this, and sure enough we have last name show up there and first name. And notice even when it prints it out as a string, even though they're all really strings. Alright, so I can access any of these items, console.log A first name, or A last name. Now if you're familiar with Python, this is how you access items in a dictionary, right? You have square brackets and you pass in the string of the key, right? So first name is the string, and that should be Amelia, and then this should be last name, and that should be Anderson. Alright, so Amelia Anderson, that looks good. But this can get a little tedious, and in JavaScript, if you don't have any special characters in your key name, and it's a legal JavaScript identifier, then you can just use the dot operator instead. So this is very handy. So generally speaking, if you can if you can, try to make your key values camel cased, so that way you can use this syntax because it's quite a bit faster and quite a bit easier. Okay, so we can see if we run this, sure enough, first name Amelia, last name Anderson. All right, so that's all well and fine. Now let's say I wanted to add a property here that was the full name of this person. So this would be full, and in this case we'll use another casing just to keep it interesting, and that is a legal JavaScript identifier. You're allowed to use underscores and identifiers. So full name is legal, and what I want to do here is say have the first name plus a white space and then the last name. Okay, so here I can say Amelia space Anderson, right? But this, I'm repeating myself here. Okay, so I have to type this name twice. So let's say for some reason I decided to change the name, or I have misspelled this person's name, and I need to change that. It turns out the last person's name was Anders. Well, now I have to change Anderson to Anders in two different places, right? That's not ideal. Okay, so instead of adding this item to my object here in the object literal, right, what I can do is add it later after I've created the object. Okay, so here I've created A, and I can add my property a dot last underscore name and set that equal to a dot first name, add a space, concatenate is the plus sign for strings. So the operator, the plus operator, when you have strings as operands, it concatenates the strings together or joins them together. So I have a dot first name, a space, and a, and then in this case, because of the special character here, I have to use the other syntax to access that value, last name. Now for demonstration purposes, I am changing up the casing style. Generally speaking, you want to use camel case in JavaScript, but I'm just showing that you can use multiple cases and the different ways that works. Okay, so here we've added the property last name, and we've got first name space last name. And now we can run this again, and we can see, sure enough, first name and then last name. Now if I need to change one of these, I can just change it in one place, and it automatically changes it in both places. So that's one key to computer science, is you want to try to only have to define things one place, especially with data, because if you have to change it, you want to only change it in one place and have that take effect throughout your entire program. Okay, so there's last name, and let's say we have another way we want to make this name appear is last name first. Sorry, this should be full name, not last name. Full name. Yeah, there we go. Console.log. And since full name with the underscore is a valid identifier, full name, then we can just use the dot operator to access it again. Right? So that's full name. Now, what if we want to another method or another property on our object that's the full name of this user, but we want last name first, right? So we can say and in this case, we might have a space. We can say full name last first. And so we've got spaces in our key, so we can't use a normal JavaScript identifier, so we have to use the square brackets and string syntax. So in this case, we have a dot last name, right? And last name is hyphenated, so we have to use the special syntax, last hyphen name, right? Then we're going to add to that a comma and a space, and then we're going to add to that a dot first name. You got to make sure our casing is correct. All right. Then I can log that, console.log a, and I have to use special syntax, full name, last first. And this is again just accessing this property, which is the last name, comma, and the first name. See here, Anderson, Amelia. Now again, if I have to change any of this, I've only defined it in one place, so it's nice. Another way I could do this last one here is using a special type of, it's a relatively new way to write strings, and allows you to interpolate variable data into the strings. What I mean by interpolate is it injects the string value of a variable or of a piece of JavaScript. It will evaluate that JavaScript to a single value and give you the string version and place it inside of your string. So to do that, you use backticks. Right? So instead of this stuff, I can use backticks, and then whatever variable I want to specify, you do $, left and right, curly brackets. So this is similar to the format string in Python if you're used to this. Python doesn't have that $sign beforehand though. But what I can say now is a dot last name, right, comma, space. Oops. So outside, anything inside the curly brackets is the JavaScript that's going to be executed. Right? So this is just going to get our property a.lastname. So outside of the curly brackets, I'm going to have, this is just a normal string character, comma, space, and then I have another interpolated value. This is going to be a.firstname. Okay, again, anything inside the curly brackets here is just JavaScript that will execute and return a value. Okay, so you could have all sorts of stuff in here, function call, anything like that. But just think of this like the Python format string if you're used to that. So you have to use backticks to define it, and then the individual variables you want to, or JavaScript that you want to interpolate, do $ curly brackets. Whereas in Python it would just be curly brackets. All right. So that's another way to accomplish the same thing. We run that, sure enough, it all works just fine. Okay, so we have these 4 properties, and I might want a list of these items. So I can use console or object.keys. So we'll make a nice little label here. And I can create a variable called keys and set that equal to object.keys, and the argument to this function, so this is a function, and the argument it takes is a particular object. So our object is stored in the variable a, so we're putting a in here. And what this does is it returns a list of all of the key values of our object. Okay, it returns an array of the keys of our object. So I can print that out. And this is also a trick of how we can get the length or the number of key value pairs in our object. So console.log, I can log keys, and then console.log, I can log keys.length. Okay, and don't forget your semicolons. I left one off there. JavaScript is pretty forgiving with the semicolons, but in some cases it can mess things up. So you want to make sure you have them. And try not to leave them off, because it can be hard to hunt down those types of errors. But as I said, it's usually pretty forgiving. Alright, so we run this, and sure enough we have a list, and these are all of the keys of our object. First name in camel case, we have last name in kebab case, we have full name in snake case, and then we have full name last first with spaces in it. Right? And we see that the length property does work on arrays, so that's one way you can find out how many items are in the list. So similarly, misspelled that a little bit, object.keys. So similarly, we can get a list of values just like we got a list of keys, and we can get the length of that as well. So console.log object.values. Right? And similarly, we create a variable values and use object.values, pass in as an argument our object A. We can also log this, console.log values, console.log values.length. Run this, and sure enough we have objects.keys and values. So the values are on the right hand side, right? So Amelia Anderson, and then Anderson, comma, Amelia, right? So that's one person. We can also do object.entries. So I'm going to save time. I'm just going to copy this whole section and paste it below and change it to entries. Okay, and change this to object.entries. And change this to entries. And copy and paste, copy and paste. So object.entries is a list of lists. Each list in the list is a list of the key as the first item and then the value as the second item. So if we go back up to our object definition, it would be a list where this is the first item as a string and then the value is the second item as a string. And then the next item in the list would be a list of 2 items. So we can test that by running this, and we see we have an array here of arrays. Okay, so I can access the key or the value in that way. Right, so this is nice, and one way I can, another way I can iterate through the items of a list is with a for loop. Okay, so I can say a simple for loop in JavaScript for let I equal 0 while I is less than, and I might make the key values first. Right, I could get some keys like we have here. We have keys, so I've already got that stored. Or we have values. I could use any one of these arrays, but I want to make an index starting at 0 and stop when it's less than the length of, or stop as soon as the length gets to the length of one of these arrays, right? So I could use any of these to access items. So I'm going to use entries because that contains both of my items, my key and my value. So I'm going to say, well, I is less than entries.length, I plus plus, and that means I'm going to add 1 each time I get down at the bottom of the loop. So I is going to start out at 0. I'm going to perform this if this expression is true. Right? So if I is less than entries.length, I'm going to proceed in the loop. And at the end of the loop, I'm going to add 1 to I. Then I'm going to check again, is I less than the length of entries? If it is, I'll proceed with the loop. If not, that's when I break out of the loop. So as soon as this expression becomes false, I break out of the loop. So basically what I'm doing here is one at a time, I'm going to get the key and the value. So entries, again, is an array of arrays, right? So entries I is going to be this first list right here. So the first item in that list is going to be 0, and then entries I. The second item in that list, the item at index 1, is going to be that. All right, so we can run this, and sure enough we have key, the item at index 0 of entries I. So I is 0 starting out, which means we're referencing this first list with entries I. Then reference by index, we're accessing the 0 index item of that list. Right? Same thing here, entries sub I, first time through the list, we're talking about I as 0, so that's this first list. And then this time, the item within that list we're accessing is index 1, which would be the second item. So then we go through the loop. So that's essentially printing out these 2 items there. And we go through the loop. It might be easier to understand if I use key, and I'll say the key equals this, and then the value And so I am really just printing out the key and then the value. Okay, so sometimes using variable names can help you document your code and let people know what's happening. If they see something like this, that's not at all a big deal in a professional environment, but you don't see that a lot in early JavaScript courses where you have accessing a list by index and then immediately accessing another member. That's slightly advanced. It's really not too bad, but point being is I can use variables to document my code to make things look a little bit clearer. So it's obvious that this item is supposed to be the key and this item is supposed to result in the value because of the way I named my variables. Okay, so that's iterating over an object with a simple for loop. And there are lots of ways to iterate over an object. So I'm going to skip some of that. And let's go down and let's create another person. All right. So we created a person this way first with an object literal, and this was kind of a mess. Well, ideally what I'd like to do is create another person, but I just want to pass in a first name and a last name. I don't want to have to type all of this out again. What if I have 100 people I want to add? Right? So this isn't a very nice way to create this object. Right? I can copy and paste this code, sure, but then my code size gets large, and I have to transfer that over the internet every time somebody loads my web page. It can get to be a bit much. So what I want to do is find a better way to create this object. Okay. So one way I could do that is just make a function. Right. So I can just define a function up here, and I could say I want to call this create person. Okay. And if I get my spelling right. So I'm creating a person, and what I want to pass in is a first name and I'll just call it first, and a last name. Okay, and then I want to do all of this stuff, right? So basically I can copy all of this and paste it in here, and I'm going to create some object, and I'll call it A, and get a first name, but instead of Amelia, I'm going to set that equal to whatever I got here as the parameter, right? And for last name, instead of Anderson, I'm going to put in whatever I got here as a parameter. And then the rest of this just uses these two properties. So this will stay the same. I don't have to change any of this. So now I can create as many of these people as I like using a simple function that returns an object. Now, the key point here, I do have to return a value from my function. And as we discussed before, the return value of a function is basically what that function call evaluates to. Okay, so we talked about expressions evaluating to a single value. Down here, console.log, if I have object B, I want to create a person, and this is going to be, I don't know, Barney Baldwin. Okay, so I'm going to create a person, Barney Baldwin. This is a function call. It's the name of the function, and I have left and right parentheses. Inside of those parentheses are the arguments or inputs to the function. Okay, so when JavaScript sees this line of code, it's going to look and see, do I have a function called create person? It's going to look up in the code. Yes, I do. And I've provided arguments down here, so I'm going to slap them in up here. So first variable is going to be the string Barney, and the last variable here is going to be the string Baldwin. And so it's going to execute this code one line at a time until it eventually reaches a return statement. That return object basically replaces this entire line once the function finishes. So it will basically just return an object. Okay, so what I want to do is save this in a variable. So I'll call this one, oops. I'll call this one B. So I'm going to create a person. So now I can iterate through these items, or just console.log. My cursor keeps jumping around. There we go. Console.log B. and now we see we have another object, and I can create as many as I want by simply passing in a first name and a last name. So that's a nice, easy way to create objects. Okay. Now, another way to create objects is using a constructor, and it's a little bit more complex, and it makes use of a word "this" that is the source of a lot of confusion in JavaScript. This does not work the way it does in a lot of other programming languages. In JavaScript, it's quite a bit different. So we'll just start with the basics of creating an object with a constructor. So this is console.log, and we're going to have object C. And what we want to do for this one is we're going to create a function again, but this function is going to be a little different. One thing that's just semantics, you don't necessarily have to do this, but it's considered good practice. We're going to capitalize the very first letter of the function. So this is going to be function, and I'm going to call this person. Okay, similarly to our other function, you do not have a semicolon after you define a function like this. That's my mistake. So I have a function person, and similarly I'm going to have a first name and a last name to take in. Now, instead of creating an object like this and then adding items to the object that I'm creating is referred to as this. So I can say this dot first name, and I can set that equal to first. I can say this and then reference square brackets because it has the hyphen in it, right? Last name. I'm just copying and pasting to make sure I don't make a mistake. Set that equal to last. Now notice the difference here. These are individual JavaScript statements. We have an equal sign. When I was making the object literal, I had a colon, then value, comma, key, colon, value, comma, key, colon, value, comma. These are individual statements, assignment statements, right? And so I still also want to do these, right? So these are a little bit different. These are this dot full underscore name equals this dot first name plus the empty string plus this and then last name. Alright, and then we have this one. This full name and space last space first, and we're setting that equal to this string. So this is a template string, and we can interpolate variables. What are we interpolating? This last name, and then we have a comma and a space, and then interpolating this dot first name. Okay, so notice that I'm not returning anything. When I'm making a constructor, this is what this is known as. I'm creating an object with a constructor. Okay. When I create an object with a constructor, I don't return anything, and also I need to use the new keyword when I call the function. Okay, so down here, let C equal new, and this is a person object. And so this up here is always referring to the object being created. Okay, so when I'm calling this, my intention is to create an object. This always refers to one individual object being created. In this case, I'm going to pass in two names, the first name and the last name, right? So we might have Carson Carlisle, right? And that's a variable C, and we could say console.log C, and we can print that out and run it. And sure enough, we have all of the same stuff. New person. Okay, so this is reminiscent of some other programming languages where you create, using the new keyword, you create objects using new and instantiate the constructor. So we'll go more in depth on this object in a little bit in future sessions, but for now this is enough with objects. So take a minute and look at this code if you need to. I'll scroll down, and if you see this, you can pause, and there's the last section.